They called the cops to take my cabin, but they were standing on federal land. When I bought the old snow cabin at the edge of Silver Ridge, the agent told me, no HOA, no neighbors, just peace. He was half right. The nearest neighborhood was a mile downhill, the infamous Aspen Valley HOA, the kind that fined you for mismatched curtains. From my cabin window, I could see their rows of perfect houses, and somehow they could see me too. By winter's first snowfall, their president, Linda Cartwright, had already sent me 3 letters demanding I comply with community snow removal standards. I didn't live in their community, but Linda didn't like being ignored. One afternoon, as snow fell heavy, I heard a knock. 2 HOA board members stood there in bright parkas. "Sir, your cabin violates winter ordinance," one said, clipboard ready. "My cabin isn't part of your HOA," I replied. They smiled, the kind of smile that said, "We'll make it part of ours." By nightfall, they'd taken photos, measured distances, and even complained about my wood smoke. That's when I realized they weren't just nosy. They were territorial. The day the sheriff's cruiser pulled up, the snow was falling in thick, lazy spirals, the kind that made the world seem quiet, sealed off from everything beyond the tree line. The sound of tires crunching over frozen gravel broke that stillness, echoing across the valley like a warning bell. Through the frosted cabin window, I could see the flash of blue lights reflecting faintly off the icicles hanging from the roof. For a split second, I wondered if something serious had happened, an accident maybe. Then I saw the sheriff stepping out, clipboard in hand, and realized the truth. Someone had complained, again. I slipped on my boots and stepped outside, the cold biting my lungs. The air smelled of pine and ash, remnants of the wood fire still burning inside. "Morning, deputy," I called out. He nodded, brushing snow off his hat. "Morning, sir. You the owner of this cabin?" "Sure am. What's the trouble?" He flipped open his clipboard, squinting at a printout. "Got a report from the homeowners association down the hill. Says your chimney's producing heavy smoke and, quote, posing an environmental hazard to the community air quality." I almost laughed. Environmental hazard. The only community nearby was a row of half-empty chalets built by retirees who thought mountain living meant rustic decor and Wi-Fi that sometimes lagged. My chimney smoke. It was from birch logs, dry, clean, and legal. The deputy looked up. "Mind if I take a look?" "Not at all. You want some coffee while you're at it? It's freezing." He smiled. "Wouldn't say no to that." Inside, the cabin was warm and quiet, filled with the faint hum of the old wood stove. The walls were lined with maps, land surveys, property lines, and old forestry division charts. The deputy took a seat at the table, glancing around like he'd stepped into a different century. "Nice place," he said. "You live here full time?" "Mostly weekends," I replied, pouring coffee. "Keeps me sane. HOA folks don't seem to like that much." He chuckled. "I've heard stories. They tried to fine a guy once for having the wrong shade of brown on his deck stain." "Sounds like them," I said. "So what's this about the chimney?" He pulled a small device from his pocket, stepped outside for a moment, then came back in. "Well," he said, glancing at the numbers, "readings are clean, no excess emissions, nothing illegal about it. So I'm good." "Better than good." He looked around the room again, then pointed at a corner map I'd pinned up, an old U.S. Geological Survey map with faded green borders. "Mind if I ask where you got that?" "Came with the cabin," I said. "Previous owner left a whole pile of them." He leaned closer, studying it. Then with a low whistle he muttered, "Huh, that explains a lot." "What do you mean?" He tapped the map. "See this line here? That's the boundary between residential development and federally managed forest land, and according to this, your property's right on the edge. Technically." He traced his finger further north, landing right on the mark where my cabin stood. This spot here sits on the federal side of the line. Wait, are you saying my cabin, on federal land? Partially, yeah. These lines haven't been updated since the 80s, but by the looks of it, you're straddling the border. Means you're outside HOA jurisdiction. The words hung in the air like thunder. Outside their jurisdiction. I felt something shift in my chest, a strange, quiet satisfaction. All their complaints, their fines, their letters taped to my door, they meant nothing. They'd been playing sheriff in a territory they didn't own. The deputy must have read my expression because he smiled knowingly. Let me guess, they've been giving you a hard time. You could say that, I replied. Last week, they sent a letter saying my snow tires were an eyesore. He laughed. Yeah, sounds about right. Well, for what it's worth, sir, this cabin's clean. I'll file the report, but the HOA's got no authority here. They can complain all they want, federal land trumps local rules. I poured him another cup of coffee. Appreciate that, deputy. No problem. Just one thing, if you ever make any major changes to the land, might want to check with the forestry office. Technically, they oversee this patch. Noted. After he left, I stood by the window, watching his cruiser disappear into the storm. The snow swallowed the sound of his tires, leaving only the hiss of wind through the pines. Federal forest land. The words looped in my head, soft but heavy. The more I thought about them, the more I realized just how deep this went. If the HOA had no authority here, that meant every citation they'd filed was void. Every threat, every warning, nothing but paper and noise. And Linda, the self-appointed environmental steward of the HOA, had no idea. I walked to the back door, stepped outside, and looked toward the valley. Down below, the HOA houses sat lined like teeth, uniform, polished, identical. My cabin, by contrast, was rugged, built from dark timber and stubborn will. For years, they'd treated this mountain like a trophy shelf, a place to display their wealth and control. I was just the outsider who refused to conform. Now I had the upper hand. I didn't rush to tell Linda. Let her file another complaint. Let her send her letters and warnings. Each one would be a little thread unraveling her authority, piece by piece. Over the next few days, I started doing my homework. I went through the deed, old land records, and forestry archives. The more I dug, the stranger it got. The cabin had been built decades ago by a park ranger named Thomas Brandt, one of the first to survey this section of forest. His journals, still kept in a weathered chest in the attic, mentioned a border discrepancy the county never resolved. He'd written, "The land belongs to no one. The forest reclaims what paper divides." That line felt almost prophetic. I could already imagine the look on Linda's face when she learned the truth, that her HOA empire had no reach here, that her complaints would vanish into bureaucracy like snow into wind. I leaned against the window frame, watching the snow drift down over the fence. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk screamed sharp and lonely. This wasn't just about property anymore. It was about something older, wilder. The mountain had its own laws, not written by boards or committees, but carved into rock and root. And as the fire cracked behind me, I decided something simple. I wasn't just going to live here. I was going to defend it. The next morning, I took the sheriff's words as gospel. I nailed a small metal sign on the gate at the base of my driveway, nothing flashy, just a quiet statement of fact. Private property, federal jurisdiction beyond this point. That night when the snow stopped and the moonlight turned the valley silver, I saw movement down the hill, a flashlight beam cutting through the trees. Linda checking up again. I stayed inside, silent, watching as she reached the gate and froze, the sign catching her light. She read it twice. Her jaw tightened. Then she turned, muttering something I couldn't hear, and disappeared into the dark. For the first time since I'd bought this cabin, I slept without tension. The storm outside no longer felt hostile. It felt like protection. They thought they could scare me off the mountain. They didn't realize the mountain was never theirs to begin with. And as the wind howled against the steel chimney, I smiled to myself. The game had changed, and this time I wasn't the one on defense. The storm had barely cleared when they came back. It started with footprints, neat, deliberate tracks pressed deep into the snow leading up to my porch. Then came the knock, sharp, entitled, like someone who'd never heard the word no in their life. I opened the door to find 3 of them, the self-proclaimed compliance committee of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association, standing in the cold like they owned the mountain. And at the front, wrapped in a fur coat so white it nearly glowed against the frost, stood Linda. She didn't bother with greetings. She simply raised a clipboard, already flipping through pages. "Mr. Collins, we've received multiple complaints regarding smoke emissions, vehicle placement, and unapproved exterior modifications." "Exterior modifications?" I asked, leaning against the doorframe. "Yes," she said, tilting her head toward my porch. "That," she gestured at the small wooden rack where I'd stacked neatly cut logs, "is not HOA-approved structure material, nor is the truck in your driveway. And per Article 12, Section 6, residents may not use open combustion heating without emissions clearance from the Environmental Subcommittee." I couldn't help it, I laughed, loudly. "Something funny?" she asked, voice tightening. "Yeah," I said, folding my arms. "You just listed about 4 violations that don't apply to me." Her eyes narrowed. "Excuse me." "Linda," I said, taking a step closer, "you and your committee have no jurisdiction up here. This cabin sits on federal forest land, not within HOA boundaries. You can't fine me, you can't regulate me, and you definitely can't dictate what kind of firewood I burn." She blinked, stunned for half a beat, then recovered with that perfect plastic smile she wore like armor. "We'll see," she said, brushing invisible snow from her sleeve. "You may think you're exempt, but your driveway connects through our easement. That means you're still subject to our community standards." I raised an eyebrow. "You're welcome to test that theory, but next time bring someone who actually knows the law." Her nostrils flared. She glanced at her clipboard again, scribbling something like she was signing a royal decree. "You'll be receiving an official notice of noncompliance," she said, "and I highly recommend you address it promptly." "Thanks for the recommendation," I said, shutting the door. Through the window, I watched her stand there for a long moment, lips pressed tight, as the other 2 committee members shifted awkwardly behind her. Finally, she turned and marched back down the hill, heels crunching through the snow like brittle twigs. I should have known that wouldn't be the end of it. By the end of the week, a stack of envelopes sat in my mailbox, each stamped with the HOA seal, each thicker than the last. Inside, citations, fines, and urgent warnings. Unauthorized emissions from solid fuel burning appliance. Improper vehicle storage. Non-permitted fencing along community perimeter. Failure to display house number signage compliant with HOA font policy. I almost choked laughing at that one, font policy. It would have been funny if it weren't so obsessive. Every day brought another letter, another final notice, another demand for payment. They even taped one directly to my door in bright red ink, like a scarlet letter of suburban outrage. And every time I ignored it. Because the deputy had already told me the truth, this land didn't belong to the HOA. Not by an inch. The mountain itself was federal territory. Their rules stopped at the boundary where their tidy lawns ended and wild pine began. Still, they couldn't stand being ignored. On the 5th day, Linda herself came marching up again, this time without her committee backup. She parked her Lexus halfway up my icy slope, slipped twice climbing it, and arrived on my porch red-faced and furious. "You're going to regret this," she snapped before I even opened the door fully. "You think you can just opt out of the community. You're part of it whether you like it or not." I stepped outside, letting the door close behind me. Actually, I said, I'm not. Not by county zoning, not by land deed, not by any legal definition. You think you're clever, she hissed, jabbing a manicured finger at me. But the HOA has friends in county offices. We can file injunctions, environmental complaints. Already tried that, I interrupted. Didn't work out, did it? She froze. Her lips parted just slightly, and that's when I saw it, the first flicker of doubt. She didn't know. The sheriff hadn't reported back to her. No one had told her that her so-called authority ended long before my driveway began. And I wasn't about to enlighten her. You can't burn wood here, she shouted, desperate now. You can't park that truck in plain sight, you can't. I raised a hand. You can't enforce anything here, I said, calm, steady. Her mouth snapped shut. The silence between us was heavy, the kind that only happens when someone realizes, deep down, that they might be losing. She smirked finally, but it didn't reach her eyes. We'll see, she muttered. Then, in a move that almost made me laugh, she pulled out her phone, stepped aside, and dialed. Hello? Yes, this is Linda Cartwright, HOA Chair of Whispering Pines. I'd like to report a possible environmental violation. Illegal burning, unsafe emissions. Yes, he's still here. I could hear the dispatcher's muffled voice on the other end. She gave my address, my name, every detail she could think of. Then she hung up and crossed her arms. The police are on their way, she said with triumph, as if she just summoned divine retribution. I looked at her for a long moment, then turned, walked inside and shut the door. Through the curtain, I watched her packing outside, waiting for sirens that wouldn't mean a thing. I could almost hear her muttering, rehearsing whatever speech she'd planned to deliver to the responding officers. I brewed another pot of coffee. The smell filled the cabin, strong, smoky, grounding. The minutes passed. No sirens, just the slow hiss of the wind against the chimney. When the sheriff finally did arrive, the same deputy from before, he didn't even bother getting out of his car right away. He sat there, talking with her through the open window, listening while she gestured wildly toward my cabin. I stepped out onto the porch with my mug. Morning again, deputy, I called. He smiled. Morning, Mr. Collins, just following up on a report. Linda spun around. Yes, finally, please issue the citation, the smoke. The deputy held up a hand. Ma'am, we've been over this. This property's outside HOA jurisdiction. There's no violation here. Her face went pale. What? That's impossible. He lives right next to our development. Ma'am, he said patiently, the survey maps show this cabin sits on federal forest land. HOA rules don't apply. If you've got an issue, take it up with the Forestry Service, not us. Linda's jaw dropped. For a moment I thought she might actually explode. She opened her mouth, closed it again, and then turned on her heel, storming back to her car. The deputy gave me a small nod, then followed her down the hill. As their taillights disappeared through the trees, I let out a slow breath I didn't even realize I'd been holding. For the first time, it felt like the mountain itself was on my side. The snow shimmered in the last of the sunlight, untouched, quiet and free, exactly as it was meant to be. Inside, I poured the rest of my coffee and sat by the window, watching the forest sway. I could still see Linda's footprints, carved deep into the snow, leading down the hill, a trail of frustration slowly filling with white. She thought she could bury me in paperwork. She didn't realize she was standing on the wrong ground. The game had officially begun. Only this time the rules were written by the mountain, not the HOA. The morning the black SUVs appeared, the snow had fallen in thick, silent waves all night. The world outside my cabin looked untouched, every pine bough sagging under white weight, the air so still that even my breath seemed reluctant to disturb it. I just started the fire, poured a cup of coffee, and was settling into that quiet mountain rhythm when the first crunch of tires shattered it. Through the frosted window, I saw headlights slicing through the trees, not one vehicle, but three. The lead was the familiar sheriff's cruiser, but behind it came two dark SUVs, their windshields tinted, their movements deliberate. The kind of cars that didn't belong on a back road like this unless something serious was happening. I stepped onto the porch as the convoy stopped at the edge of my property. The sheriff climbed out first, tipping his hat, but his expression wasn't the easy smile I'd seen before. Then the SUV doors opened, two men and a woman in dark green jackets with gold patches that caught the light. U.S. Forest Service. Federal jurisdiction. "Morning," the taller one said, flashing a badge. "Agent Ryland, Federal Forest Service. You Mr. Collins." "That's me," I said slowly, trying not to sound too curious. He nodded. "We received a call from local authorities regarding a land use complaint. Wanted to verify the boundaries." I hid a smirk. Linda, of course. She'd probably doubled down after being told off by the deputy. Her ego couldn't stand the idea of being wrong, so she escalated. And like clockwork, her obsession with rules had brought in people whose rules actually mattered. "Sure," I said, gesturing toward the steps. "Come on in, I've got all the paperwork." Inside, the agents moved methodically, polite, but thorough. One scanned the walls and windows, another glanced over the chimney setup, jotting notes. Agent Ryland sat at my small wooden table while I slid the folder across. Survey maps, deed transfers, forestry letters. He studied them in silence for a moment. Then, without even looking up, he said, "You built this yourself?" "Mostly," I said. "Bought it as a fixer-upper years back. It was an old ranger's cabin before they decommissioned the post." He nodded, impressed. "Good work. And this?" He tapped the official letter from the forestry department. "This confirms what we thought. You're inside federal boundary. Technically, your property is under a protected land lease, not HOA regulation. Meaning?" He looked up, smiling faintly. "You're good." The words landed like music. The sheriff, leaning by the door, let out a short chuckle. "Told her that last week," he muttered. As if on cue, a voice shrieked outside, "This is outrageous." We all turned toward the sound. Linda was there, fur coat flapping in the wind like a cape of indignation, clipboard clutched in one gloved hand, stomping up my snow-covered path like she was leading a protest march of one. Behind her, two of her HOA disciples trailed nervously, one holding an umbrella that did nothing against the swirling flakes. "Mr. Collins," she shouted, eyes blazing, "you have no right to invite federal agents onto our property without board approval." The sheriff actually laughed. Agent Ryland straightened, adjusting his jacket. "Ma'am," he called calmly, "this isn't your property. This is federal land under U.S. jurisdiction." She blinked, confused. "That's impossible, the HOA maps." He cut her off. "HOA maps are not legal boundary documents. We operate by federal GIS surveys and recorded deeds, and according to those records, this cabin and surrounding acre are fully under Forest Service domain." Linda's mouth opened, but no sound came out. For a woman who'd built her identity around being right, that moment hit like a slap. "I demand you issue a citation," she finally snapped, waving her clipboard as though the sheer motion of it could reverse the universe. "This man has been burning unapproved fuel sources and storing non-compliant equipment." Agent Ryland raised a hand, calm but firm. "Ma'am, you're currently trespassing on federal property. You need to leave." That single sentence froze her where she stood. The snow seemed to stop midair. "Excuse me," she said, voice trembling between outrage and disbelief. "You're standing on federally protected ground," he repeated, tone even but unyielding. "Without authorization, which means legally you're trespassing. I'm asking you to return to your residential boundary immediately." Her two lackeys looked at each other, pale. One of them started to back away. Linda, however, wasn't built for retreat. She puffed out her chest and pointed the clipboard at him like a sword. "You have no idea who I am." "I don't," Ryland said simply, "and it doesn't matter." Her mouth opened again, but no words came. The silence stretched. Then the sheriff stepped forward, scratching his chin. "Linda," he said gently, "I'd take his advice. They're not the kind of people you want to argue property lines with." She glared at him. "You're enjoying this." "Little bit," he admitted. The two federal agents began taking photos of my chimney, the forest boundary markers, even the old ranger post sign half buried under snow. The entire time, Linda hovered nearby, muttering under her breath, her power slipping through her fingers like melting ice. Finally, Ryland approached me again. "Everything checks out, Mr. Collins. You're within compliance. We'll file a note confirming your boundary exemption from residential oversight." "Appreciate that," I said. "I was starting to think common sense had gone extinct." He chuckled. "Not yet, it just takes paperwork." As they turned to leave, Linda made one last attempt. "I'm not finished with this," she snapped, voice echoing through the trees. "There will be consequences." The sheriff paused halfway down the path and looked back at her. "Yeah," he said dryly, "but probably not for him." The SUVs rumbled to life, headlights cutting through the snowfall as they descended the mountain. Linda stood there long after they were gone, shoulders stiff, the clipboard now drooping at her side. For a moment, I almost felt bad for her, almost. Because that was the instant it truly dawned on her. The HOA's kingdom ended at the edge of the pavement, and beyond that lay a world she couldn't control. I stayed on the porch, hands in my pockets, watching her realize it, that subtle unraveling of certainty, the fragile look in her eyes as the fortress of her authority began to crumble. She turned then, meeting my gaze through the falling snow. No words, just that silent fury of someone who'd been publicly defeated and didn't yet know how to live with it. I smiled, small, quiet, enough to sting but not enough to gloat. She spun around and stormed back down the hill, boots slipping on the ice. One of her assistants hurried after her, calling her name. The clipboard fell into the snow halfway down the slope. She didn't pick it up. That moment alone, that beautiful second when the realization hit her like winter itself, was worth every frozen night, every shoveled path, every hour I'd spent breathing mountain air she tried to regulate. The mountain had drawn its boundary, and for the first time, it wasn't just my land she couldn't touch. It was my peace. From that day on, whenever I saw her Lexus parked at the bottom of the hill, she stayed in the driver's seat a long time before daring to step out. Because even she understood now, on this side of the line, her rules didn't matter. And the silence of the forest, cold and endless, made sure she never forgot it. The snow had barely melted when the federal agents returned. This time, they came with surveyors, tripods, scanners, and thick binders marked U.S. Forest Service Property Verification Unit. I stood on my porch with a steaming mug of coffee, watching them move like a quiet army across the land. Every few minutes, one would call out coordinates, another would stake a bright orange flag into the ground, and a third would double-check readings against an old, yellowed map. It was almost cinematic, this mix of precision and quiet authority. Linda stood a few hundred feet away, wrapped in her fur coat again, jaw clenched, hands on hips. Behind her, a few of the HOA board members huddled together under umbrellas, whispering like they were plotting a suburban coup. I could almost hear her voice in my head. "He's bluffing. He's just some backwoods squatter with a chimney and a truck." But when one of the agents approached her with a clipboard and an official-looking folder, I saw that expression falter. He pointed toward the snow-covered trail that wound behind her manicured backyard, the same path she and her friends had proudly called HOA Heritage Walk. I knew what was coming. "Ma'am," the agent said, his voice calm but firm, "this section here, approximately 42 feet in width extends into federally protected forest land. The homeowners association has no jurisdiction beyond this line. Linda blinked, eyes narrowing. That can't be right. That trail been there for 30 years. The man nodded. And it's been illegally maintained for 30 years. We checked the original plats and boundary deeds. The entire HOA development encroaches roughly 6.3 feet into the buffer zone. That's federal property, not community easement. For a moment, no one said a word. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. I took a slow sip of my coffee. Finally, Linda spoke, voice quivering with forced authority. You can't just move the line. We've maintained that trail. We've landscaped it, cleaned it, improved it. That, said the agent, is exactly the problem. He turned, motioning toward the nearest survey flag. Federal law prohibits unauthorized alteration of forest-adjacent terrain. Landscaping, grading, or drainage modification without clearance is considered encroachment. Fines apply. We'll be reviewing all past activities here. Her face paled like she'd just been told the IRS was moving into her guest house. Behind her, one of the board members whispered something that made her spin around sharply. Even from my porch, I could see her lips move. Not now. The agents continued their work, their reflective vests bright against the white snow. They didn't argue, didn't raise their voices. They simply measured the truth. And every new stake they drove into the ground was another nail in the coffin of her illusion of control. By afternoon, they'd outlined the entire disputed section, orange flags marking where HOA territory ended and federal protection began. The border ran right through her trail, slicing it into two awkward halves. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. Later that evening, after the agents had gone, I walked the property line myself. The flags fluttered in the twilight like sentinels of justice. It was quiet, except for the distant hum of wind through the pines. When I reached the section that cut through the Heritage Walk, I noticed something half buried under the snow, one of the HOA's decorative wooden signs, the kind they'd hammered in with polished stakes. Private trail, HOA members only. I kicked at the snow until the sign came loose and lifted it in my gloved hands. The irony nearly made me laugh. Private, it said, yet the ground it stood on belonged to the American people. The next morning, 2 men from the Forestry Service returned. They carried thick metal posts and heavy aluminum signs. Each one bore the federal crest in bold black letters. Protected Federal Zone, unauthorized entry prohibited. U.S. Forest Service, Section 14B Code 5.1. The sound of the first sign being hammered into the ground echoed through the valley. Clang, 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 like a bell tolling for the end of the HOA's reign. Linda came out again, furious. "This is harassment," she shouted. One of the agents didn't even look up. "No, ma'am, this is enforcement." By the time the last sign was in place, the once pristine HOA trail looked more like a crime scene. Red and white tape marked off sections where they'd have to conduct soil inspections and erosion checks. I overheard one agent mention the word fines. Another mentioned civil liability. That night the glow of her house was dim. Usually her floodlights blazed until midnight, washing my cabin in harsh white glare. But that evening the path was dark. A strange peace settled over the forest. The air felt different, lighter, freer. I sat by my window with a fire crackling behind me, sipping whiskey instead of coffee this time. Outside, the metal signs gleamed faintly under the moonlight. I imagined them whispering in the wind, their message clear. This land isn't yours to bully. Over the next few days, the fallout spread like wildfire through the HOA. Emails leaked. Meetings turned into shouting matches. A rumor reached me through the general store clerk in town, a man named Ernie, who knew everything before anyone else did. He leaned over the counter, grinning. "Linda's losing her mind," he whispered. "Word is, The Forest Service is auditing the HOA's maintenance fund. Something about misuse of association dues for unauthorized landscaping on federal property. I didn't even pretend to be surprised. Guess karma works faster in winter. Ernie chuckled. You should have seen her face when they posted the signs. Looked like someone repossessed her kingdom. Over the next week, snowstorms rolled through. The trail turned into a forgotten strip of buried earth. No HOA members ventured near it anymore. Not after the federal agents started making surprise visits with cameras and drones. Linda's grand community path now led straight into a restricted area. A border she couldn't cross, a rule she couldn't rewrite. One morning I walked past the signs again, brushing snow off the metal. Each word shimmered in the sunlight like a warning carved in stone. I realized something then. This wasn't just about land. It was about control, power, ego. She built her life around the illusion that she could dictate the world's boundaries. That rule's bent for people with manicured lawns and lawyer friends. But out here, out in the cold, indifferent silence of the mountains, nature and law spoke louder than ego. A few weeks later, I received an envelope in the mail. It was from the U.S. Forest Service. Inside was an official letter thanking me for reporting repeated unauthorized activity and confirming that the federal boundary of Section 14B had been reinstated and fortified. Attached was a small laminated card. Federal Observer Access Permit, Volunteer Land Steward. I smiled. Not only was I untouchable now, I was part of the system that had crushed her. That weekend, I hung the HOA's old wooden private trail sign inside my cabin, right above the fireplace. A trophy not of vengeance, but of quiet satisfaction. Because in the end, justice didn't need to roar. Sometimes it just needed to draw a line in the snow, one no HOA could ever cross again. For the first time since I'd moved into that snow-wrapped cabin, the mountain felt alive again. Not in the chaotic, angry way it had been during those weeks of confrontation, but in the quiet rhythm of something reclaiming its breath after being strangled. No more letters shoved under my door. No more HOA patrols with clipboards and neon vests marching down the path as if they were guarding Buckingham Palace. No more Linda shrieking about ordinances and community standards from behind her fur collar. The silence that followed wasn't just peace. It was victory. I woke up earlier these days. The light came in soft, bending through the frost-covered windows in golden ribbons. Every creak of the cabin felt like the sound of belonging. The snow outside, untouched and gleaming, stretched all the way to the forest line, unbroken by footprints, fences, or petty human claims. It was mine again. Not legally, spiritually. When I stepped outside that first morning after the storm, the air bit cold against my face, sharp and honest. My breath fogged before me like a ghost fading into the wind. For a long time I just stood there on the porch, axe in hand, listening. No drone hums. No chatter. Just the groan of pine branches under snow and the distant call of a hawk. I chopped wood until my gloves froze stiff. Every strike echoed through the valley, not with defiance but with freedom. Smoke curled from my chimney, lazy and perfect, rising into the clear blue sky. I smiled, remembering how Linda once called my wood burning environmental vandalism. Now it was a symbol of everything she couldn't touch. Every so often I'd see her car crawl past on the road below, a shiny white SUV, the kind that looked more suited to mall parking lots than mountain passes. She never honked, never stopped. She just drove by slowly, her face half lit by the reflection of the snow, her jaw clenched so tight it looked painful. Once she even rolled down her window just enough for me to see the fury still flickering behind her eyes. I met her gaze calmly from the porch. Didn't wave, didn't smile, just stared back, steady as stone. After a few seconds, she accelerated away. her tires spitting gravel like words she couldn't say aloud. That was the thing about people like her, they needed conflict to feel alive. Without control, without someone to push against, their lives collapsed inward, hollow and echoing. The silence that soothed me was the same silence that tormented her. It wasn't long before I started noticing the signs of her unraveling. At first, it was small. The HOA's community updates stopped appearing on the bulletin board near the general store. Their winter festival, usually a parade of overpriced cocoa and fake smiles, was quietly postponed due to unforeseen circumstances. Then came the whispers, the kind that travel faster than snowmelt. Rumor had it that several homeowners were furious. The HOA fees they'd paid for trail maintenance and environmental improvements had vanished into legal bills after the Forest Service investigation. There was talk of audits, even lawsuits. Linda had gone from Queen of the Hill to defendant of her own making. I remember standing on my deck one twilight, watching the last orange light fade from the sky. The forest looked endless from here, dark and ancient, its silence older than any homeowner's rulebook. I realized something then. This mountain had outlasted hundreds of Lindas. People came, built fences, drew lines, argued over imaginary ownership. And when they were gone, the trees simply grew over their footprints. The silence wasn't empty. It was patient. A few days later, I took my snowmobile down into town for supplies. Ernie, the store clerk, greeted me with his usual grin. "Guess who tried to file an appeal against the Forest Service ruling?" he said, eyes gleaming. I didn't even have to guess. Linda. "Bingo," he laughed. Got laughed out of the office. Apparently, she claimed the mountain's aesthetic unity was being violated by government signage. You can't make this stuff up. We both chuckled. I grabbed a few bags of feed and a bottle of bourbon, my quiet celebration for the night ahead. When I rode back up, dusk was falling, that deep, blue-gray quiet that only winter in the mountains can hold. The lights from the HOA houses shimmered faintly below like distant city stars. And for the first time since this whole mess began, I realized I didn't feel anger anymore. Just clarity. This place, this life, it wasn't about proving anyone wrong. It was about remembering that peace doesn't need permission. That night, as the fire cracked inside, I sat by the window and watched snow drift lazily against the glass. The world outside looked untouched, sacred even. My reflection merged with the darkness beyond, the lines between man and mountain blurred. Then faintly, I saw headlights. Linda again. Her SUV slowed near the base of my drive, headlights sweeping across the frozen pines. She didn't get out this time, maybe she'd finally learned. But she lingered there, engine idling until it began to snow heavier. For a long moment, we were both just figures separated by distance and consequence. And I thought if she could hear my thoughts, I'd tell her this. "You didn't lose to me, Linda. You lost to your own reflection." She drove off finally, tail lights fading into the trees. The sound of her tires disappeared, swallowed by the snow. After that, I didn't see her for weeks. The HOA meeting stopped altogether. Some of the houses went dark, seasonal residents who'd packed up early or perhaps just wanted to avoid the drama. Nature moved back in like a slow tide reclaiming the shore. Deer returned to graze near the trail, now lined with federal protected zone signs. Birds nested in the fence posts she once called eyesores. It was as if the land itself was erasing her touch, one snowfall at a time. Some evenings, when the wind howled through the trees, I imagined the forest whispering its gratitude. Other times, when the silence grew so deep I could hear my own heartbeat, I'd wonder if peace was the loudest sound of all, the one we forget to listen for. I started writing again. Nothing fancy, just a journal of life on the mountain. Notes about the weather, animal sightings, the way the snow shimmered at dawn. But beneath the words, every page carried the same truth. Silence is not emptiness, it's reclamation. Weeks turned into months. The mountain remained quiet, steadfast. The only thing that changed was me, lighter somehow, stripped of the bitterness that had fueled me through the battle. And though I'd never admit it aloud, part of me hoped that somewhere down in her perfectly manicured home, Linda was hearing that same silence, and that it terrified her. Because for people like her, the worst punishment isn't losing control. It's realizing the world never needed it in the first place. A month passed, a month of quiet mornings and long, peaceful nights. The mountain had returned to its rhythm, crisp air, thick snow, and the sound of wind sweeping through the pines. I'd almost forgotten the chaos of the HOA war. Almost. Then the phone rang. "Mr. Callahan," the voice said, official and clipped. "This is Ranger Hallbrook with the U.S. Forest Service. You might want to hear this." I straightened up, heart kicking a little faster. "What's going on?" He sighed through the receiver. "Seems your neighbors, the HOA folks, have been making some improvements along the forest boundary. Trail maintenance, gravel dumping, and the installation of several benches and lighting fixtures. Problem is," he paused for effect, "those installations are sitting squarely on federal land." I couldn't help it, I laughed. Not just a small chuckle, but a full, unfiltered, mountain-shaking laugh. "You're kidding me." "I wish I were," he said dryly. "We've already confirmed through satellite imaging and boundary markers. They pushed about 30 feet into protected ground. It's an open and shut violation." "Let me guess," I said. "They're calling it community beautification." "Exactly that," he replied. "But the federal code calls it environmental interference." By the time I hung up, I was still grinning. I poured myself a cup of coffee and stepped out onto the porch, watching the morning fog drift through the trees. The air smelled like pine and irony. It didn't take long for word to spread. Within a week, bright yellow federal notices appeared along the HOA's walking paths, bold, official, and impossible to ignore. "Unauthorized activity on federal land, under investigation." The HOA Facebook page exploded with outrage. Someone uploaded a photo of the signs, captioned, "Who vandalized our community space?" Another member replied, "Probably that hermit up the hill." Linda's influence lived on. By Thursday, the HOA held an emergency meeting. I didn't attend, of course, but I didn't have to. Small towns and mountainside communities have their own kind of telegraph system. The grocery clerk, the post office manager, the old men who play cards at the diner. By noon the next day, I'd heard everything. Apparently, Linda had marched into the meeting like a martyr, slamming her stack of papers onto the table. "We've been entrapped," she declared. "This is retaliation from that man in the cabin. He's been working with the government to destroy our neighborhood." One of the board members, a retired contractor, reportedly asked, "Linda, are you saying you didn't know you were on federal property?" Her answer, as recounted by the clerk, was priceless. "Those signs weren't there before." "Because you removed them," the contractor shot back. The meeting fell apart after that. Half the members sided with Linda, claiming she was the victim of a technical oversight. The other half were furious that she dragged them into a federal fine that could reach tens of thousands of dollars. By the weekend, a few had already resigned from the board. The backfire had begun. I went down to the ranger station a few days later, part curiosity, part courtesy. Ranger Hallbrook greeted me with a grin. "You must be enjoying the show." "Let's just say karma's got good aim," I said. He chuckled. "Well, here's the kicker. The Forest Service's Regional Division has decided to designate your land and the surrounding half-mile as a protected monitoring zone. We'll be assigning a civilian steward to oversee activity." I raised an eyebrow. "A civilian steward?" He nodded, "Meaning someone who lives nearby and keeps an eye out for trespassing or environmental violations." "And who exactly are they assigning?" He handed me a form, my name already printed at the top. I couldn't help the grin that spread across my face. "You're serious?" "As a landslide," he said. You'll get a small stipend for seasonal monitoring, and your role will make you an official point of contact. Think of it as federal backup. For a long moment, I just stared at that paper. It wasn't just irony, it was poetic justice written in government ink. The same HOA that had tried to evict me, fine me, and call the cops now had to answer to me. I signed the form on the spot. When I got home, I tacked the notice right beside my front door, not to brag, but as a reminder. Every time I saw the embossed Forest Service emblem, I remembered how close I'd come to giving in to their nonsense. A few days later, the first Forest Service trucks arrived. They surveyed the damage the HOA crews had done, the chopped saplings, the gravel dumped into runoff channels, the bench posts driven deep into fragile soil. I walked with the agents, pointing out where the old trail markers had once stood. Linda appeared halfway through, wrapped in her usual fur-lined coat, her lips tight with fury. "What do you think you're doing?" she snapped. "This is our land." One of the agents turned calmly. "No, ma'am. This is United States federal land and you are currently trespassing on it. Please step back behind the boundary." "I have permission," she barked. "From who?" the agent asked, unimpressed. She turned toward me, eyes burning. "From him. He told us the lines were different." I smiled slowly, the kind of smile that carried years of quiet satisfaction. "Linda," I said softly, "the only lines I've ever drawn were the legal ones." The agents didn't even look at me. They were too busy measuring, photographing, writing citations. One of them handed her a yellow slip. "This is your official notice. The HOA will receive the fine documentation within the week." She crumpled it in her hand, her breath visible in the cold air. "You think this is over?" she hissed. I shrugged. "It was over the moment you started digging in soil that wasn't yours." She turned and stormed off, her boots crunching through snow. By the next morning, the fines were public. The HOA faced penalties exceeding $180,000 for federal encroachment, unauthorized land alteration, and environmental negligence. Their maintenance fund, the one they'd bragged about for years, was wiped clean. Several members resigned outright. I sat on my porch that evening, coffee in hand, and watched the sun bleed gold into the snow. The mountain seemed to hum with quiet approval. The same path where Linda once marched around with her clipboard was now marked by official boundary stakes and bright yellow tape. Federal property, protected land, every inch of it under watch, my watch. Later that night, I checked my new badge. It wasn't much, a small laminated card with the Forest Service seal and my name underneath. Civilian Land Steward, Regional Monitor. I turned it over in my hands, the firelight catching the edges. Some victories didn't need revenge, they just needed time. The following week, I received an official payment voucher, compensation for land observation and compliance assistance. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough to make me chuckle. The government was now paying me to protect the very forest Linda had once tried to police. I pinned the notice on my cabin wall, right beside my map of the ridge. And from that day on, every time I hiked the trail and saw the faint remains of their gravel paths, I smiled, not out of spite, but out of awe, because the land always gets the last word. When spring came, grass began to grow through the cracks of the disturbed soil. Saplings sprouted between the rotted benches. Nature was reclaiming what arrogance had borrowed. One afternoon, while walking the boundary line, I saw Linda again, standing by the HOA sign, staring at the federal warning beside it. The contrast said everything. Her rules ended where reality began. She looked older, smaller somehow, swallowed by the vastness of the forest. For the first time, she didn't yell, didn't threaten. She just turned, got into her SUV, and drove off without looking back. That was the moment I realized something profound. The backfire wasn't just legal. It was cosmic. Because in the end, she didn't lose to me. She lost to the truth, the kind written not on paper, but in the soil, the snow, and the silence of the mountain itself. And as I stood there, wind tugging at my jacket and sunlight bleeding through the trees, I felt something deeper than victory. I felt peace, the kind that comes only when nature itself takes your side. Spring arrived late that year, dripping slowly down from the mountaintops as though winter was reluctant to leave. The snow melted into silver streams that traced through the trees, pooling near the trail Linda once called her community path. The air was sharp but full of life again, pine sap, damp earth, the faint sweetness of thawing moss. It was on one of those mornings that the knock came. I wasn't expecting mail. No one really delivered this far up unless it was a bill, a catalog, or trouble. But when I opened the door, the courier handed me a large, cream-colored envelope, sealed with a dark green insignia, U.S. Department of Forestry. The return address said Washington, D.C. I signed for it, thanked him, and took it inside. For a moment, I just stared at it on the kitchen table, my coffee steaming beside it. The envelope looked official, important, like something that could either ruin your week or redefine it. When I finally slid it open, I found three things inside: a printed letter, an identification card, and an embossed certificate with my name on it. Appointed volunteer steward of the Federal Preservation Zone, Section 14B. The letter was brief but powerful in its simplicity. Mr. Callahan, the Department of Forestry acknowledges your ongoing cooperation and commitment to the preservation of federally protected lands. Your diligence in documenting boundary disputes and unauthorized maintenance has ensured the continued protection of U.S. property. Effective immediately, you are hereby designated as a volunteer caretaker of the Section 14B Federal Protection Zone. Your duties include periodic observation and reporting of environmental violations, light trail and boundary maintenance, ensuring compliance with federal access restrictions. This role carries no enforcement authority, but does grant you federal reporting privileges and operational oversight of the protected section. We thank you for your service to public land integrity. Office of Land Stewardship, U.S. Department of Forestry. I sat there for a long moment, staring at that last line, operational oversight. It took a second to sink in. It meant that the same trail the HOA had built their nature walk through was now, officially, under my jurisdiction. I wasn't just the guy with the cabin anymore. I was the eyes and ears of the federal government, the mountain's legally recognized caretaker. And Linda, she had no idea. I pinned the certificate to the log wall beside the kitchen window, where the morning light hit it perfectly. The paper gleamed faintly, almost reverently, beneath the golden beam of sunlight. Then I poured myself a second cup of coffee and stepped out onto the porch. Down below I could see movement, a shiny black SUV creeping up the gravel road toward my cabin. The license plate glinted in the sun. HOA plates. I smiled. Sure enough, Linda's car came into view, tires crunching over the last patches of melting snow. She was wearing oversized sunglasses and that ridiculous fur-trimmed coat, as if she thought the mountain air might stain her humanity. She parked just beyond the newly posted sign, the one that read, Federal Property, Entry Restricted, VIOLATORS subject to penalty. I leaned against the railing, coffee in hand, waiting. She got out, adjusting her coat, clutching a folder of papers like they were holy scriptures. "We need to talk," she announced, her voice slicing through the morning stillness. "Morning, Linda," I said, my tone deliberately calm. "Beautiful day to respect federal jurisdiction, isn't it?" Her eyes narrowed. "Don't play games, Callahan. We've received notices that our walking trail is being reclassified as protected terrain. I need to see the documentation." "Sure," I said casually, setting my mug down. I walked back inside, retrieved the freshly opened envelope and returned with it in hand. "You mean this?" She froze as she saw the green insignia, her jaw tightening. That's official. Straight from D.C., I said, almost apologetically. Came this morning. Apparently, I've been designated the volunteer caretaker of this section. My job is to make sure no one enters without clearance. Her face went pale. You're lying. I flipped the certificate toward her so she could read the embossed seal for herself. The federal emblem shimmered under the sunlight. I'd be careful standing there, I said, lowering my voice just enough for it to sting. That's technically on restricted land now. Her head jerked around, scanning the ground like it might betray her. She took an involuntary step backward. Restricted, she echoed. Mum, I said, boundary starts right there. I pointed to the freshly staked markers where the Forest Service had posted their signs. Crossing that line without authorization could get you a hefty fine, especially since this area's under active monitoring now. You can't be serious, she muttered. You don't have authority here. Funny, I said, holding up the laminated ID card that came with the letter. The Department of Forestry seems to think I do. For a moment she just stood there, speechless. I could practically hear the gears grinding in her head, the same ones that had fueled her obsession with control for years. She built her empire of rules, her HOA kingdom on fear and compliance. Now she was standing at the gate of something larger than her reach. The one thing she couldn't bully, federal law. Her lips parted like she wanted to say something clever, but all that came out was a hiss of frustration. She turned bright red, then pivoted toward her SUV, heels crunching through the gravel. Careful, ma'am, I called after her, unable to resist. You're entering federal property without clearance. She stopped dead for half a second, her shoulders stiffened, then climbed into her car and reversed faster than I thought possible, tires spitting gravel like fireworks. As her SUV disappeared down the winding road, I leaned back on the railing, letting out a deep, satisfied sigh. The forest around me was utterly still, except for the wind brushing through the branches and the faint creak of melting snow. It was funny, really. For months she'd tried to use every local law, every zoning regulation, every scrap of suburban authority to bend the world around her. But up here, above the cul-de-sacs and manicured lawns, she'd run into something older and stronger, something she couldn't rewrite, nature's sovereignty. By the next week, the story had spread like wildfire through the community forums. Linda's HOA fined for federal overreach. Cabin hermit made honorary ranger. Some believed it, others thought it was a joke. But the photos of the boundary signs and my laminated ID card soon killed any doubts. The HOA went quiet again. Meetings were canceled. Their patrols stopped walking near the forest edge. For the first time, the mountain felt respected. Sometimes I'd find tire tracks just past the sign, a quick stop, a hasty retreat. Maybe Linda testing fate. Maybe her friends checking to see if the federal land myth was real. Either way, they never stayed long. One afternoon, I decided to take a hike through the newly designated area. The sunlight was warm, the forest alive with the sound of renewal. The old trail the HOA had cut was still there, faint beneath the needles and leaves, but nature was reclaiming it quickly. Saplings had begun to grow through the gravel they'd dumped. Moss crept back over the benches they'd installed. I stopped at the edge of the clearing and looked out toward the valley below. From up there, the HOA's rows of houses looked tiny, uniform, little boxes lined up in neat compliance. And in that moment, I realized just how different our worlds were. Down there, people measured control by fences, rules, and meetings. Up here, control was meaningless. The mountain didn't care about bylaws or boundaries. It only respected balance. As I walked home, the wind picked up, carrying the scent of cedar and rain. The trees creaked softly, almost approvingly. The mountain had spoken, and I had simply listened. Later that evening, I sat on my porch, the federal badge gleaming beside my coffee mug. The sun dipped behind the ridge, setting the world ablaze in gold and orange. I wasn't sure what would come next, maybe more letters, maybe more attempts from Linda to regain her lost power. But for now, I had something far better than victory. I had silence. The kind earned, not enforced. The kind that only comes when justice aligns with nature itself. And if Linda ever forgot where her power ended, well, there was always the sign at the bottom of the hill to remind her. Federal property, entry restricted. By summer, the HOA tore down its private path signs and stopped mentioning my name. The one-sprout enforcers now avoided the edge of the woods entirely. And every morning, as sunlight hit the snow-capped pines, I'd stand on my porch with a cup of coffee, watching peace return to the mountain. They called the cops to control me. But in the end, I didn't just win the fight. I owned the silence they could never reach. Because when you mess with nature's rules, you eventually find out who really owns the land.